Hello and good morning. It is Sunday, June 28th, 2026. I'm Mike Riston. This is 10-minute exposure YouTube version. Planning on working on some photos. Been putting it off for a couple days now. Got out the other night, went up to farm country, about 45 minutes north of Baltimore, and took some long exposures along the farm roads. Really excited to work on them, and then I didn't. So it is gray, rainy, humid, pretty uncomfortable, and I'm going to use this opportunity to get caught up on some coffee and some photo work. Thought I would walk you through how I am using the latest version of Darktable, which is 5.6, to process my work and get it ready for upload to the internet, as well as printing. If you live in Baltimore or are interested in coming to Baltimore, we have got the, I guess it's the 4 times a year, maybe 3 times a year, recurring print swap at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. That is happening on August the 22nd from 10 a.m. to noon, roughly, at the Enoch Pratt Free Library Central Branch at 400 Cathedral Street. Rules of the game are really simple. You come out, bring some prints with you. Maybe bring, I think the going is about 6 or 7 prints people bring, anywhere from 4x6s up to 11x14s. We've had folks bring bigger. And you're welcome to lay them out on the tables in the fine arts department, walk around and look at the work of other photographers. And if you're so inclined, you can trade or steal. There are really no rules to it. Just as long as the person says you're welcome to take their stuff, you can walk away with a print or two. It's a great opportunity to see your work in print. Obviously, I think any chance you get to print your photos is a chance you should take. And it's also a great way to see work from some really great Baltimore photographers, really blown up and looking good, better than it does on a screen, and maybe walk home with some prints for yourself to hang on the wall. So again, come on out and join us. Even if you don't live in Baltimore, you are welcome to come. We're really close to the train station, so come on out. So yeah, I'm working on some photos to get ready for that. This is one of them I'm thinking about bringing. And so yeah, let's dig into it. What you're seeing in front of you right now is the photo as it appears when you first open it in Darktable. It's, I think, one of the best raw editors, raw manipulators out there. First of all, it's free. You can't beat that. It works on Windows and Linux and Mac OS, which is what I'm using. And it does a phenomenal job doing very complex edits and, cataloging, keywording, tagging, geotagging, all that fun stuff. The things, photographers really live for and really truly look forward to much more than being out and taking photos. Honestly, it's just tagging your work and wiggling sliders around. This is a great tool for doing that. I think it does a much better job than some of its competitors out there. And I'll show you why. I'll walk you through why I think that might be the case. All right, so let's get into it. Like I said, this is the raw file. One of the very first things that I'm going to do when I look at a photo is make note of what I want to change, what I think is working well, and maybe map out what tools I'm going to use to achieve my desired end state. Now, my philosophy when it comes to processing photos is to not be overly heavy-handed with it, to let the natural scene sort of speak for itself as much as you can. Obviously, I think every photo can benefit from some processing just to clean it up a bit. And so as I'm looking at this one right here, I'm thinking right off the jump, there are a couple of things I really like, and obviously a lot of things that are going to need some work. So I love the atmosphere in this photo. I really like this. There's this red happening across the street from the brake lights on my car, which is parked on a little dirt road. Loving the reflection of the brake lights on this buggy crossing sign. You're getting some full moonlight that's peeking through the clouds a little bit as it's finding its way across the sky behind these trees. Uh, and there's this dichotomy between light and dark that's not dramatic, but is moody. So the dichotomy there is not extreme, but it is, I think, pretty cool. But there's obviously some room for improvement. Uh, Taking this from a really low grade mid photo to a uh, moderately mid photo. So I think a couple things that obviously need to happen. It needs brightened. The elements that I was just talking about, the light, the contrast, obviously needs a little bit of work to make the parts of the photo viewable, more viewable that I want more viewable, but to retain that contrast in the trees and the sky. I think the color is okay, but it's a little too gold. I think I shot this at daylight white balance exposure, and I think this could actually benefit from being a little cooler. This is not really how the sky looked to me when I was in this scene. It was a little bluer, not quite as gold as this is. So I'm going to do some white balance correction. Yeah, so I think the modules that I'm going to use to do this are maybe 4 or 5. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the how and why behind each tool because I think there are much better YouTube videos out there that do that. But I am going to walk you through the ones that I do use and why I use them. So first thing first, the recommended starting point when you're working on your photos in Darktable are to make 2 key changes right off the jump in this order. First, adjust the exposure and then adjust the white balance. I adjust the exposure using the exposure tab, which is pretty simple. It starts out at a plus 0.7 exposure value, and that is to compensate for the flatness of raw files. And the way exposure works in Darktable, as I've messed around with it and as I've watched other people mess around with it, is that it is heavily constrained by the tone mapping tool that you choose at the beginning when you first set up Darktable. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but first I'll just say that when you do make changes to the exposure in this, it is not a global boost universally at the same value to highlights and darks and midtones. It very heavily biases the midtones and then relies on the tone mapping module to constrain highlights and shadows, whites and blacks, to give a very natural and realistic exposure boost. So rather than listen to me prattle on about it, here's what that looks like in practice. So I'm going to just gently raise the exposure. And as I'm doing that, you're noticing that there is not a dramatic jump in the tonality or the exposure of these very dark areas. You'll see that they stay really close to black. You are seeing a dramatic jump in the exposure here in the sky where there is some light, over here in the grass where the red from the brake lights is illuminating it, and everything else stays dark or light accordingly. So you'll see that I just added a very I think a pretty fair amount of exposure compensation. What you're looking to do as you boost this is get your midtones where you want them. Don't worry about everything else. We'll mess with those in a separate module. But right now, you just want the parts of your image that are important to be kind of that center point of the exposure as you're looking at it, the perceptual, sort of that perceptual center of the photograph that you want people's eyes drawn to. Get that into the right exposure frame, and then let tone mapping and some other tools deal with the extremes. So for me, I really want this buggy sign to be the focal epicenter of this photograph, and I'm going to raise the exposure accordingly until just that is where I want it. Now, one of the things I love about Darktable is it has this step back mode. One of the things that I'm always doing when I'm working on, if my kids are painting something or if I'm writing or drawing something, I always like to take a step back and look at it from a distance to see how it looks, because it's very easy to get tunnel vision, and just taking that step back really helps you appreciate the view from a little bit far back. And so Command B on the Mac, or just hit this little light bulb icon here, puts it in this framed viewer that gives you a white border. Really good for judging exposure and color. And what I'm seeing is, based on this white frame, I could probably stand to jump the exposure just a little bit more. Something right about there. I think that's pretty good. So we'll call that good enough. Next thing we're going to do is tweak the white balance. Obviously, I think most folks are used to, in Lightroom or Capture One or other tools, there being a dedicated white balance module with a temperature slider and a tint slider. Darktable doesn't necessarily have that per se. It does have a white balance module, but it's not what you should use for white balance. You should really use this color calibration tool. It is white balance at hyperspeed. And the way that it handles white balance is based on the color of the illuminant in the scene. So when we talk about illuminant, we're talking about the light source. And what you can see here is that this is shot using a daylight exposure, daylight white balance calculation. And it's calculating that light. If you look at this kind of tan yellow color, it's really saying that that's the source of the illuminant in this scene. And that is how it's going to calculate the temperature of the rest of the colors surrounding it. So you can move this slider here further to the left and get a cooler scene. You can slide it to the right and get a warmer scene. But what you'll notice is missing is there is no tint slider. And that is because Darktable handles white balance just a little bit differently. So if you click this drop down and look at your different choices here, you can pick a bunch of different light sources. You can pick an incandescent, tungsten light color calculation here. You'll see that it's calculating it based off of an incandescent illuminant, so warm light like you would see inside or under sodium vapor light. You can pick a fluorescent, like you would see in fluorescent lit rooms, obviously under different tube lights. And there's a bunch of different options that you can pick there. So, if you were looking at a daylight lit scene, or daylight calibrated fluorescent tubes, well, there's a white balance for that. There's a D50 simulator for D50 illumination, which is about 5,000K versus D65, which is 6,500K. But what I like to do is just click this eyedropper. And what the eyedropper does is it looks at the scene, everything within this bounding white box, and it is looking for a tone or a hue or a shade anywhere in this photo that hits roughly mid-gray, 18% gray. And so it's looking, I think, if I'm guessing, primarily at this white stripe down the side, maybe some of the road there. And it's guessing that this is the correct illuminant for the scene, which is actually pretty close to tungsten. You'll see that it has a color bar here. It's put a little marker think of this as a color wheel at this orange illuminant shade. And what it's going to do is it's actually going to inject the opposite of that color, which is right over here in the blues, to correct for that color cast. And you can control the strength of it and thus the tint of it by moving this chroma slider. So if I move this further to the left, it is skewing the colors more towards the orange that it has decided is the illuminant. If you move it to the right, it's going to introduce more of the blue to correct for this extreme orange, which it has decided is the illuminant. So that is how you can control temperature and tint in Darktable. I'm going to click that again. That's what the software has decided is the correct color combination. You can also zoom in and take a look and select your own boxes. So we get some really cool teal and orange looking shades there if you want to go for like a very extreme cinematic look. If you want to just pick this white section and back out, clicking buttons and not doing the right thing. And again, here you get this very, it is now selected the illuminant as more of a red orange, and thus the sky is getting more teal, which is pretty cool if you want to go that route. I think that sometimes that can get just a bit extreme if you're not exactly right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to what the software said was standard, and I'm going to just tweak it a bit in favor of being cooler. So I'm going to move this tint more towards the blue, and I'm going to get it right about here. So we can zoom in and take a look at this a little closer and then zoom back out. I think that's about right. I'm not going to say it's perfect, and we'll probably mess with this later, but for now, I think this is pretty close. Okay, so we've done our exposure, we've done our color calibration. The next thing that I want to do is adjust contrast. And I'm going to adjust contrast two ways. First, I'm going to apply a lookup table at about 50 to 60% strength that replicates Fuji Eterna to give this a little bit of a cinematic, less contrasty, a little bit more natural look. And then I'm going to tone map the image using this AGX module. So first, let's apply our lookup table. So you're going to come up here to the LUT 3D tab. If you don't have the LUT 3D tab, you can just type that in the search bar, and there it is. I have a preset for Fuji Eterna that I'm going to hit. It uses a Eterna simulation that a very knowledgeable smart person on GitHub produced. I'll put the link in the description below so you can go check it out. But yeah, so here's the Fuji Eterna simulation. And so let's take a look at what that did. You'll see that my preset first applied it at 60%, which is, I think, pretty good. You know, if you put it full strength, it doesn't make a huge change, but I do think that it flattens the image just a bit much. So let's pull that back up to full, and then let's drag this down. And you'll notice that as I change it, let's look at the sky here. Here's 100%. You'll notice everything gets kind of flat and gray. And then as I bring that back down, some more of the blue shines through. Now, it's probably not easy to see with YouTube compression, but from where I'm sitting, there's a difference. So let's back that back out. Cool. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is tone map this image. Now, tone mapping is essentially assigning the values of highs, lows, and midtones to a contrast curve to give the image natural roll off in the highlights and in the shadows, and to make sure that nothing really clips, that the extreme whites are not harshly overly white, and that the transition from mid gray, midtones to highlights is natural, and then vice versa on the opposite side. Darktable has a lot of different tools for doing this. The one that I prefer to use is AGX, which is a tool that came from the 3D modeling community from Blender. And the thing that I like about AGX is that it combines color and contrast at once, so that as you adjust contrast, color doesn't immediately jump, and get overly saturated. That the transition and saturation as you increase contrast is more articulated, a little more natural, and you don't end up with extreme saturation when you go for extreme contrast. So yeah, that's my pitch for this. I use a custom preset, which I made, which is essentially just moving the shoulder power to 2.8, which is usually at 3.3. The reason I like to do this is because I think that a more natural looking photo for me does not have incredibly bright highlights, nor does it have incredibly dark shadows. So this is really just the bog standard AGX module, just with an adjustment to the shoulder power to bring the highs, the high parts of this curve, down to be a more believable, flatter, more neutral contrast. So let's walk through how you would use this. You have a bunch of different sliders here. All of them do very complicated mathematical things that I do not understand and probably will never understand, but I do know enough to say that the contrast, shoulder power, and toe power do the bulk of the work, and that is where you should focus your efforts to start with. the contrast slider does exactly what it says it's going to do. It's going to increase or decrease contrast. So if you move it up here, you'll notice that the image gets contrastier. If you move it this way, you'll notice that it loses contrast. And as you drag this around, you'll notice this S curve down here changes with it. So this is no different than using an S curve on, in Lightroom or Capture One to get contrast, with the exception that you can define how it affects color here on this tab, which that is a video for another day, but just know that you can fine tune how that contrast curve impacts color. And you can control how it impacts the highs and the lows of the image. So if we add that, if we add just a touch of contrast here and say, well, I really want there to be more contrast in the highlights, I can drag this to the right. And what you'll notice is here where there are a lot of highlights, as I drag this up, they're going to get slightly contrastier. If I drag this down, they are going to lose contrast. Now, again, on YouTube, you probably can't see this, but here on my screen, it's making a pretty sizable difference. So if I reset that, here in this bright portion of the sky and down here, especially in this grass, there are changes occurring in the contrast that are very subtle, but too much, and it looks unnatural. So I like to bring this down again to about 2.8. The toe power controls this bottom portion of the curve. And if I drag this up, you are going to immediately see, because there is a lot of dark data in this photo, if I drag this up, the dark portions of the photo get dramatically darker. If I drag this down, those same portions of the image get dramatically brighter. So I usually keep this at about 1.5, but I will tweak it up if I want to give myself a little more contrast in just the shadows without impacting the contrast elsewhere in the frame. So we're going, I think right around here is probably good. I might back that off just a little bit. Little manipulations make all the difference in the world. And now we are looking kind of mid. We're looking much better than we were earlier. Now, an optional step you can take if you don't want to control the contrast, just using the slider, so we can reset this. I'll put that back where it was. And you can actually start, if this is what you want to do, you have options, a lot of different options. You can actually use this color picker to let the software define the upper and lower margins of white relative exposure and black relative exposure. So just think of this as setting your white and black point relative mid-gray in this image. So again, you can click this color picker. It's going to look at 80% of the image. It's going to determine where the white point is and where the black point is, and it's going to set it for you. So this gives you a pretty decent floor for controlling exposure. So then I'm going to come back down here to my contrast curve, and I'm just going to give it a little tweak again. Nothing overly dramatic. I think probably right there is good enough. All right, we're going to step back and just take a look here. All right, I think that looks pretty darn good so far. Pretty darn mid, which is what we're shooting for. Pretty darn mid. I'm still not happy with the contrast between, or at least the clarity of this buggy sign, especially when you step out. I think that you could probably stand to improve the brightness here. And I don't want to impact much else in this image. I really just want to focus on this portion and nothing else. Now, there are probably 20 different ways that you can do that using different tools. And I'm going to start by using color balance RGB, and then I'm going to tweak it using the tone equalizer. Color balance RGB is Darktable's hue and saturation control mechanism. Not quite an HSL tool like you would see in Lightroom or a color grading wheel like you would see in Capture One. This is more about controlling the luminosity, the rotation of colors on the color wheel very slightly. and a little more mathematically than you would in those tools. And the way that I like to use this is skipping all of these top parts right here and jumping straight to the perceptual saturation grading. The reason I like this is because it controls both luminance and chromaticity at the same time. So it's going to control light and color at the same time as you move these sliders. So the intent is to kind of emulate this, the mechanics and physics of film, which normally would see that as a color gets more saturated, it tends to be a little darker. And as a color gets more desaturated, it becomes lighter. So I usually add a little global saturation boost of about 10%. And then I bring the shadows up about 20%. So if I were to start, at stock standard, you're going to see that this image loses some, it's going to lose some saturation. It's going to look a little flatter. So I'm going to bring this back up to 10%. And then I want you to watch what happens over here as I manipulate the shadows and midtones. So as I bring the shadows up, obviously this is getting brighter, but it's also getting darker. This orange, sort of red hue is getting darker as I drag this up. So if I drag it all the way up, you're going to notice that it is getting very dark indeed, while becoming slightly more saturated. It's not oversaturated, but the saturation is definitely impacting luminosity. So I think 20 is a good floor for that. And then for the highlights, you'll see that as I drag these down, it desaturates the highlights. And there aren't a lot of highlights in this photo, so let's see if we can find some to demonstrate this. As I drag this slider down or up, you're not going to see a huge difference here because we don't have a lot of highlights. But I'm going to drag this down anyway. And normally what this would do is I would put this at -20. And what it'll do is it'll desaturate very high portions of the image and make them slightly lighter. So you get a good light and color contrast happening there, which can add clarity to an image. It didn't do a whole lot on this image just because of how tightly packed all of this data is together, but it did help a little bit. It can help a little bit with things of that nature. What I want to do now is use the tone equalizer, which is another way of controlling contrast. There's about 50 of those in this tool or in this software. What the tone equalizer does is it acts as the the shadows and highlights and blacks and whites slider set to a horizontal tone curve. So this is some black magic here that I'm not going to spend a ton of time getting into, but what it essentially does is it's going to use a very complicated form of masking to determine the boundaries between highs, mids, lows, extreme darks, and let you control them on an 8-point exposure value scale. This is one that is just easier learned watching than it is by explaining. So imagine this histogram is going to be laid out on this tool, on this view right here. And we are going to stretch that histogram out so that it goes side to side so that we can use each of these exposure value dots to really control the range of tonality in this image. And we're really just going to focus on the sign right here. Now you'll see right now it has a question mark, and that is because we have not mapped the tones yet to this equalizer. So we're going to turn it on, and now you're going to see this histogram shows up. You can use these sliders here to stretch it out. You can go this way, you can go that way. You can use this contrast slider to stretch it out or, compress it. I think you can spend a lot of time trying to get it right, or you can just let the software do that part for you and click the little magic wands, and it stretches the histogram out here. You'll see that it didn't make any change to the photo itself, but what it did do was give me some points that I can work with to start improving and changing and increasing or decreasing tonality. And I'm going to do this probably only using 1 or 2 points on this scale. So a couple ways you can go about doing this. You can start just moving dots around until you get the image looking the way you want it to. Or you can use your mouse and this cursor over the parts of the image to selectively control the dots on the histogram. So you'll see as I'm moving this around in the little crosshair there on the screen, you'll see that what I'm hovering over right now is the part of the image that corresponds to roughly -1 EV. If you look at the histogram here on the right, as I move that around, you'll see that this line moves with it, and it auto selects the curve point closest to where the cursor is on the screen. So you can come over here and you can drag this mid-tone up, and you'll see you're going to get this big boost in the mids. You can double click the line to reset it and do the opposite, and you can control contrast there. And you'll see that as you're pulling one point down, it's going to algorithmically pull down the points closest to it so that you get a natural transition from one exposure stop to another. You're not seeing these huge, ugly gradations as you go. So if I were to come to the simple slider and I were to do the same thing, you'll see that the transitions aren't nearly as natural looking. You can get some really weird, funky artifacts in there. So I like to use the advanced tab, which is actually simpler than the simple tab. So like I said, I'm really only going to use one or two spots. I don't want to adjust the darkness here in the trees. Kind of like the road where it is. Sky is fine. I really want to focus on this bad boy right here. I want to get this this road sign looking a little clearer. I'm going to do that by scrolling the wheel on my mouse up. You'll see that as I did that, all of the portions of the curve that corresponded with about -1 EV jumped up with it. I don't want it to impact the entire image. I just really want to focus on this one point. So roughly everything that is -0.7 EV. Now, when I do that, it's also raising the sky a little bit. So I'm actually going to come over here and complement that by bringing down this one. And so now it's going to pull down some of the detail elsewhere in the photo, drag this dot down, and now we have slightly better clarity in that sign. So if I turn this off, that's what it looked like before. If I turn it on, it's looking a little more natural. I think I still want to bring this down a bit. I don't want it to be overly contrasty. I liked that muted look from before. So I just want a little boost here. And again, let's compare. Let's step it back and let's compare. And I think that is much better. You're not seeing extreme saturation jumps. You're not seeing extreme contrast jumps. We just lightly raised the exposure, so to speak, on just the sign. And that's looking pretty decent, pretty decently mid. A couple other things we can do, which I'm not going to mess with here with this photo. You can sharpen, crop, remove dust spots, change the orientation of the photo, fix the horizon. I don't necessarily see the need to do any of that with this one. One thing I might do is increase the strength of the hot pixel removal, because I did see some hot pixels in the skies. And I'm going to do that detect by 3 neighbors. Essentially what that's going to do is it's going to look at every pixel in the image and compare it to its nearest 3 neighbors and determine if it's a hot pixel or not, and then repair it. So I'm going to turn that on, and you'll see that it fixed 210 pixels. And if I click mark, it's going to show me all the pixels that it fixed in the image and where its corresponding neighbors were that helped to fix it. So pretty neat. Going to turn that off. 2 more things that I like to do with all of my photos are adding grain and softening them. Now, the way that Darktable handles grain is it uses it in junction with this denoise profile. So I have this turned on by default. What it does is it finds the ISO for your camera. So if I select this, you'll see here, it's got my camera that I used. It found that the native ISO is ISO 400. You can leave it like that and you'll be fine. If you really want to get extreme with it, you can come over here and you can say, well, I increased the exposure by about 2 stops, so I should probably raise my my noise reduction by about 2 stops. And so you could jump that up to about ISO 800. And you can look in here and see that it's removing a fair amount of noise by doing that. I don't think there's much difference between ISO 400 and ISO 800. So I'll just leave that as default. But I am going to come over here to the grain module and add a small amount of grain. Now, to first show you what a small amount of grain looks like, I'm going to apply a pretty extreme amount of grain. So I'm going to turn this on. By default, it's going to emulate 1600 ISO film at a strength of about 25%. And then it's going to apply a midtone bias to it, which I will explain in just a moment. So what you'll see is it's added some really muddy looking grain all over the midtones of this image. And if you scroll down here to the shadows, this extreme dark part of the image, you actually don't see a lot of grain. The reason for that, if I were to come up here to some of the rest of the parts of this image, the reason it applies stronger grain in this mid area is because it is emulating how some film stocks work, which is by introducing grain in bright portions of the image and reducing grain in portions of the image that are underexposed or not very exposed. So here in this dark portion of the image, we're not going to see a lot of grain. The bias, hence the name, is more towards the midtones and the brights. I think 1600 is a ludicrous amount of grain, but it helps demonstrate this in practice. So here, midtone, kind of mid-gray, we're seeing some noise, some grain in that in the street. You're not seeing it so much in the very dark part of the image. I can bring this up to even better demonstrate the point. Let's look at this very bright region here. Let's do a quick before and after. If I remove that, you're going to see that there's grain introduced here in this region where it's about 18% gray, and most of the rest of the spots are going to remain sort of ungrained. So the way that I like to do this is I just dial this down to about 160. I still think even at 160 coarseness, which just impacts the shape of the grain, 25% is still a bit much. I much prefer about 12%. And so I'm going to come in and look at this, and it's, I think, a bit more natural looking. If I turn it off, you'll see that it takes some of the remaining noise in the photo and smooths it a bit and gives it more of a, what I would expect to see when I was shooting, Portra 160 NC 20 years ago and taking night photos that were 2-3 minutes long. The grain in that looked a lot like this, to my eye. Anyway, your mileage may vary. The other thing that I like to do is fix the over sharpness of digital sensors. I think digital sensors are great for a lot of detail, but I don't like a ton of detail in my photos. I like a very soft, dreamy look. I really don't like the crunchy, crispy look of sharp edges and very well-defined details. I would much rather let color and light do that than artificial sharpness. So what I'm going to do is come to this diffuse or sharpen module. I'm going to apply this bloom artistic effect. Before I apply that, I'm going to zoom all the way out because this is going to be really extreme, and then we're going to dial it back. So I'm going to hit bloom, and it's going to look like I just, stuck my lens right into a vat of Vaseline. Like I just stacked a couple Pro Mist filters and went crazy. All that detail we just worked to differentiate using the tone modules is now a very fine smear. What I would like to do is lessen this effect. And you can do that using this nice little masking tool that every module has to help you control where and how the manipulation impacts the photo. And I'm going to click this uniformly mask, this nice round circle. And we are then presented with an opacity slider. And I'm just going to drag this back really far. And you're going to notice that the image is now much less smeary, but the details still retain some softness. So let me turn this off. Oh, we just got crunchy again. Let me turn this on. And it's blurring and softening the edges of all of this grass down here. I usually think 18% is still a bit much. I usually dial this back to about 10%. Even 10% does a good enough job of softening the image. And I think that is it. I think this is right about where I want to be. It's looking pretty decent. I might go back to the color calibration and just see what it looks like if I take away some of the warmth and go a little cooler, or if I bring it a little warmer. And for my eye, I like somewhere right in between, something like this. So I'm going to take a snapshot of this so we can do a quick before and after. So I've got this snapshot right here for color calibration, and it's going to save all of the edits we just made to this photo. And now it's going to let me go back through the history and determine, I can click on each one of these history marks and then see what it looked like when we did that change. So let's go back to the very first thing that we did, which was a exposure change, and we're going to go one step before that. So this is the image as it looked when we brought it into darktable. I'm going to come up here and click on this color calibration snapshot, and on the left it's going to show me what the photo looked like when we took the snapshot, and on the right it's going to look like it did when we first brought the photo in. So I think that's a really solid mid-grade edit. This is not going to win any awards. It's probably going to get 6 likes on Flickr. And that's good enough for me because I am very happy with that. I am very happy with that change. Yeah. So now what I'm going to do to make sure that this color calibration sticks is I'm going to click this little restore snapshot into current history. Bam. And now turn that off, get rid of my snapshots, and that's what my photo is going to look like. To prepare this for print, I want to make sure that it's going to look good on the paper that I choose, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time getting into that, but what I can show you is that there's a soft proofing tool right here. You can toggle soft proofing. And I have it set up to soft proof for the web so that I can make sure that there's nothing crazy happening with the colors. Darktable uses Rec 2020 as its color manipulation space and outputs it as sRGB for the web. So I can soft proof it and make sure that before it uploads, what I see on my screen is how it's going to look on the web. I'm doing all of my editing on an Asus ProArt 27-inch calibrated monitor. Lots of fun, really good monitor. Definitely recommend it. But if you wanted to soft proof for something else, like say you want to soft proof for Fuji premium photo luster paper, which is what I sometimes print on when I'm doing photo swaps. It's really nice paper. It's not very, it's not matte, so you're not going to see, colors are going to look pretty good, very well represented on the luster paper, and it's not a glossy paper, which is going to show a ton of fingerprints and look incredibly contrasty. You can pick that, and let's see, and that's what it's going to look like roughly printed on paper. So you'll see that because of the limitations of the printer and the paper, we're going to lose some of that color the way that it's manipulated right now. So what you could do, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time getting into it, is you could create a duplicate of this image rather, and keep this soft proofing on and go back through the edits that we made and tweak them until it looks the way you want it to. For my purposes in this video, I'm not going to go into all that. That's something for another time. But for now, I'm happy with the way this looks for the web, and I'm going to export it. Now, the way that exporting works in Darktable is you have an export tab all the way over here on the left. You can create a bunch of presets and export it a bunch of different ways. The way that mine is set up, if I click on this, you'll see that I have a folder on my desktop for all of my pics, resized for web, output for print. And then if I'm submitting them, like I just recently did for an exhibition at the Baltimore Museum of Art or others, you can create presets where it'll output them to each of those folders. So the way that I have it set up is I have this nice little algorithm that tells this to output it on my desktop in the pics folder, and then to use some wildcards and some metadata filters to rename the file based on the day that I took the photo, the year that I took the photo, the time that I took the photo, which camera I was using, so that when it exports, you'll see here, this photo was taken in 2021 in November on the 7th at 5:46 p.m. This just helps me keep all my photos in chronological order and then sorted by camera if I so wanted to. Just a gee whiz that I like to do. And then I have, that's my full res output. It's outputting it at sRGB color space, at JPEG 100%. There's a web version of that I use, which does the same thing, but it resizes it to 2400 pixels on the long edge, keeps it at 100%, outputs it at sRGB, and sticks it in a web folder on my desktop. So with those two selected down here, I can hit export, and it is exporting. So just a quick recap of the modules we use to do that. And honestly, I know this is probably like a 7-hour video, and everyone's tuned out by now, but this would normally take me about 10 to 15 minutes to do as I were going through each of these. The modules that we used to get here, we used exposure, we used the color calibration tool, we used the 3D LUT, the AGX tone mapper, the tone equalizer, grain, and softness and sharpen. And we use color balance RGB, so 7 or 8 modules right there to get us to a pretty mid-looking photo. Each one very specialized in what it does, with some overlap, but very powerful in their own right. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with the way this photo turned out. I hope you are too. Or if you're not happy, I hope that you at least learned how Darktable works and you can do it better than me. Yeah, so thanks. If you see an area where I could have improved my process, or if you have questions about, shooting at night or anything like that, drop a comment, shoot me an email, michael.riston@gmail.com. Smash that like button and subscribe, or whatever it is that the kids are doing. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.